On the settee with me today, Nikki Hayes, and we're going to talk about reductionism. Nikki.
Hi.
What's reductionism?
Reductionism? It's a way of explaining things. It's a scientific form of explanation which involves reducing things down to their component parts. For example, you take this table here. A reductionist explanation of this table is to say that all it is a collection of atoms and molecules, nothing else.
Right. Well, that's physics.
Yes.
Psychology, reductionism?
Well, there's quite a few different forms of psychological reductionism. One of them is behaviorism. That's one which students quite often encounter when they first start studying psychology, and it's been very influential in psychology. Physiological reductionism, another form of reductionism.
Mm-hmm.
Individualism, that's a common one which affects psychology as a whole, as well as some very specific types of explanations. And of course, the perennial favourite, genetic reductionism, which is something we're coming across increasingly nowadays.
Okay, so these are 4 types of reductionism in psychology. That's it, is it?
No, there are lots more. I mean, there are lots of different forms of reductionist thinking in psychology, but those are perhaps the main ones, and certainly the ones that we're going to deal with now.
Okay, all right, so our first mystery contender of reductionism will be behaviorism.
Behaviorism, yes.
All right. So, if we go back to our thing of the table, if we're looking at behaviorism, what are the atoms then of behaviorism?
The atoms of behaviorism are stimulus-response links, basically. The founders of behaviorism were people who were particularly interested in developing the idea that psychology could be understood in terms of atoms, units that could be built up into complete
building
forms
blocks
of human behaviour, big building blocks.
All right.
And what they focused on was the link between stimulus, outside stimulus, and response. So you've got the knee-jerk, stimulus comes in, foot kicks up.
Not very far.
Stimulus response. Far enough, I'd say.
Okay, so why are these building blocks important then, or why were they important for behaviorism?
The reason why they mattered was because they were trying very hard to make psychology scientific. It was J.B. Watson, really, who's known as the founder of behaviorism, and he was very insistent that psychology should be a scientific endeavour. And it's all to do with his definition of science, because when he looked at the other sciences, when he looked at physics and biology and chemistry, what he found was that in the previous century, because he was working at the beginning of this century, in the previous century they'd all had discoveries which had really transformed the way that they understood what was going on. So in physics you had atoms.
Our atoms, yeah.
Yeah. And atomic theory really made a lot of difference to physics because it started to explain structures and the properties of things.
Right.
In chemistry, you had valency in the periodic table and elements, that sort of thing, which made a lot of sense. In biology, you had two. You had cells, the cell theory, the discovery that living things were made up of cells, and you had also, later on, you had genes, the idea that heredity happened in small units, which interchanged.
So this all sounds fine and dandy. What's the problem for psychology?
Well, there's quite a lot of problems, really. One of the problems is that when you start to focus on individual elements, you've got some part of the explanation, but you haven't got the whole thing. And the real problem with reductionist thinking is that reductionism insists that all that is important are the individual elements, nothing else.
Could you show me this, maybe?
Well, I think so. I think the best way to show you this would be to move over to the cookery corner.
All right. Over to the cookery corner, then.
Over to the cookery corner.
So, here we are at the cookery corner. Why are we at the cookery corner, Nikki?
Well, Phil, we're at the cookery corner in order to understand a bit more about reductionism.
Right.
Watson, as we said before, considered that if you wanted to understand human behaviour... No, he wasn't a cook. Wasn't a cook. And in fact, we can demonstrate that he was not a cook. If he'd been a cook, he might have understood this a bit better. He believed that you combine the elements and you get to understand human behaviour. Okay, well, as every cook knows, if you combine elements of things, you don't necessarily get a combination of elements. What you often get is something quite different. For example,
what do we have here then?
We have eggs, we have currants, we have flour, we have sugar, and so on. Butter.
Cherries?
No cherries. Sadly, no cherries. However, if we
Chocolate?
combine those, no chocolate either. But if we combine those and a few other ingredients and applied heat and so on, what we get is something quite different. What we get is a cake.
Right.
Now, I've got one here that I've already done.
One you made earlier.
One I made earlier. And this is a cake, okay? Now, what strikes you about cake?
Big, heavy, tasty.
Tastier than the ingredients, yes?
Oh, right.
Has a whole different set of properties other than just the ingredients.
Right.
You can eat spoonfuls of flour and you can eat spoonfuls of sugar, but they aren't anything like as nice as eating a piece of cake. What's happened is that the cake, the combination has got emergent properties. There are things which have emerged from the combination of the ingredients which were not there before.
Right. So I would say, to use a phrase, that the whole is greater than the sum of the parts.
Absolutely. Not only is the whole greater than the sum of the parts, but it's actually qualitatively different from the sum of the parts.
And tastier.
And a lot tastier.
Right. Okay, well I think that explains that. Back to the settee then.
Back to the settee.
So here we are back from the cookery corner, and we're going to go on to our second example of reductionism, which is physiological reductionism. So Nikki, what's physiological reductionism?
Physiological reductionism is the act of trying to explain human behaviour or human activity, human experience, in terms of the sort of atom equivalents of the physiological system.
Right. And if we keep up our theme of atoms, then what are the physiological atoms?
Things like neurons, nerve cells, that is, hormones, nerves, that sort of thing. Where you start to say that human experience is produced by or caused by neurotransmitters in the brain.
All right. So what sort of things might we explain with this? What sort of human experience might we explain with neurons and?
Any number of things, really. Moods, mental illness, sex, anything.
Now let's stay with mood. So, say if I said, I feel a bit depressed today, how might we explain that then?
Well, in terms of a physiological reductionist explanation, what we do would be to look at look for an explanation in terms of depression and brain chemicals. So we'd say your serotonin levels, or serotonin levels if you prefer, are evidently out of balance, and this is what's causing your depression.
But I might say I'm depressed because I went to football last night and I saw my team Forest lose 5-0, and that is why I'm depressed.
Well, yes, and you might well be depressed
yes.
as a result of that. There's no particular problem with that.
But you've just said it's to do with my serotonin levels.
Yes, I've said that a physiological reductionist would say that's what it is. But what's more likely is that it's actually a combination of a whole heap of things. Of course you're depressed because Nottingham Forest lost 5-0. If you're a Nottingham Forest supporter, you would be. At another level of causality, you could say what causes you to be depressed is supporting Nottingham Forest in the first place.
Yeah, don't push it.
Okay, but there are multiple causes. There are lots of different causes going on. And what you can't do is just focus on one and say, this is the only cause.
So you might say that the change in serotonin level might have an effect on my mood, but watching Forest lose also has an effect on my serotonin level.
Precisely. What you've got is an interaction going on between them that each affects the other. So what's happening to you in the outside world affects the way that your brain responds physiologically. So you produce certain brain chemicals. This affects your mood. Your mood then affects how you perceive what's happening in the outside world, and so on. So you've got a continuous interaction between them. And that's the difference between a reductionist explanation and an explanation which is non-reductionist, where the non-reductionist explanation leaves room for that interaction to happen between the different levels of explanation.
You mentioned individualism, Nikki, as a reductionist problem. How's that?
Well, it's in a lot of ways it's one of the biggest reductionist problems that psychology has, because quite naturally psychologists are supposed to be interested in the individual, and that's really our raison d'etre. But the problem comes when we start saying that individual explanations are all that's needed for understanding some kind of social phenomenon.
Okay, so for example, a social phenomenon that's a problem.
Well, let's take Nazi Germany. What happened in Nazi Germany? What happened there was a very large-scale social movement where where everybody in the society became swept up in it. But there have been quite a lot of psychological attempts to explain it on an individual level. But the problem is that they're not really adequate to do so because there are lots of other factors involved.
So, an example of one of the individual explanations.
Okay, one of the classic ones would be Adorno's authoritarian personality.
Right.
Adorno was looking at how people developed the kind of mentality which led them to espouse philosophies like fascism in the first place. And what he found was that there's a whole complex, a whole personality complex involving characteristics such as very rigid thinking, inability to tolerate ambiguities, need to see things in black and white, and so on, which led very naturally towards extreme racism and towards the kind of style of thinking which was exemplified in the Nazi ideology.
Right.
Yeah.
So what's the problem with the authoritarian personality theory then?
Well, the problem is that that doesn't explain why it happened to a whole society. You know, it's not the case that every single member of German society at that time had an authoritarian personality. Some did, some didn't. But admittedly, some of those who were extremely influential had that style of personality, but there were other things going on. There was widespread economic recession or depression. There were a lot of social factors, a lot of factors about social beliefs, cultural beliefs, and so on. There was a backdrop, in fact, of genetic reductionism, which we will get onto later. There were all sorts of theories and ideas and social economic pressures.
Right, all working together in some way.
All working together. That's right. Now, when you just focus on individual personalities, what you do is ignore those pressures.
Right.
And that can't be an adequate explanation.
Okay, so can you show me this in some way?
Well, I think probably the best way to show you this one is to go back to the cookery
Back to the cookery table.
Back to the cookery table.
I can't wait. So here we are at the cookery corner again. So what are we doing at the cookery corner again, Nikki?
Well, Phil, we've come back to the cookery corner in order to explore some of the other problems with reductionist thinking. We've already established that just looking at the ingredients for a cake doesn't tell us what a cake is.
Right.
We did that last time we came. Okay, let's look at this cake.
Your cake?
My cake.
The cake what you made?
The cake what I made with my very own hands. No, thank you. However, consider this cake. What strikes you about this cake?
Okay, smaller.
It is smaller, well
but
done,
I
Phil.
suspect that's not the answer you want. It is in fact a Christmas cake.
A Christmas cake, precisely. And that's a whole different level of meaning about cake. Because when we look at a Christmas cake, what we're looking at is a symbol of a particular cultural festival in a particular culture. And that, as a Christmas cake, is quite different from cake as a piece of food. And that, again, is quite different from the ingredients that go to make up the cake. So what we've not only got emergent properties in the sense that the cake emerges from the ingredients, but we've also got a whole set of levels at which we can look at the cake. We've got cultural level, symbolism, Christmas, and so on. We've got the level of it being an item of foodstuff, and we've got the level of its ingredients.
So we haven't just got layers of icing on this cake, we've got layers of cultural meaning as well.
We've got layers of meaning, we've got layers of cultural meaning, we've got layers of scientific meaning. Yes, indeed. You thought it was just a cake.
I thought it was just a cake.
No, far from it.
So I eat cultural meaning, in fact.
You eat cultural icon. You stuff yourself full of this extremely rich thing because that's what Westerners do at Christmas.
Okay.
And not only that, but what you're doing is stuffing yourself full of something that's a combination of ingredients.
Right.
So what we've got is that if we really want to explain about the cake, we've got to look at several different levels, not just one. We can't focus on any one of them and say this is all it means.
Right, well, I think we've probably had as much fun as we can have at the cookery corner, so we'll go back to the settee.
Fine.
So here we are, back once more from the cookery corner and on the settee again. On to our next example of reductionism, which is genetic reductionism, which is?
It's a way of explaining things by reducing them down to the actions of genes, saying that what human beings are is a product of their genes in one way or another.
All right, so an example of genetic reductionism would be?
Well, one of the most common forms, one of the most common examples is the work of Konrad Lorenz, who was very, very popular in the 1950s and 60s.
Is this the same Konrad Lorenz that was a member of the Austrian Nazi Party?
Indeed it is. And it was quite interesting that his biological work focused on the apparent inevitability or genetic inevitability of things like aggression, territoriality, xenophobia and the like in animals and human beings.
So a nice link there between genetic arguments and politics.
Yes, and one which raises interesting questions about social responsibility of science.
Doesn't it?
Yes, it does. But on to the reductionist question, and the reductionist question is really about drawing extrapolations from animals to human beings.
Right, and for example?
What Lorenz did was to choose examples from birds and fish and to extrapolate things that he saw in their behaviour to human beings. So he would see, for instance, sticklebacks behaving in a highly territorial manner and assume that what this was indicative of a genetic imperative which would be exerted, in humans as well. Now, the problem with that is that evolutionarily speaking, there are a lot of animals that are a great deal closer to human beings than birds and fish. And also the fact that birds and fish have much more rigid forms of behaviour than human beings do, or even than most other mammals do. One of the things we've inherited, for instance, is a large brain which allows us to learn new kinds of behaviour and adapt our behaviour rather than inheriting rigid actions. So there are problems with selecting these things. And there are also problems with the fact that the examples ended up giving examples of kinds of behaviour which were always the darker side of human nature. What he did was to draw parallels. He'd draw a parallel between aggression in seagulls, say, and aggression in a human being. But analogy is not the same as homology. Just because something looks the same.
Analogy is not the same as homology,
Yes,
and a homology is?
Homology is when something really is the same. It's the same type of thing.
Right.
Analogy is when it looks the same. And what happened was he would see something which looked the same and assume that it was really exactly the same thing.
The work of Konrad Lorenz, that's a bit old now. Is there a more up-to-date version of genetic reductionism?
Yes, there is. In fact, genetic reductionism has never really died out from the popular agenda, and the current version, the most popular one at the moment, is known as sociobiology. And the trick in sociobiology, the thing that's new, is that what it's managed to do is to explain a few things which Lorenz couldn't touch. It reaches the other parts, as it were, because Lorenz's theory was only able to explain the darker sides of human nature, or only attempted to explain the darker sides of human nature. What sociobiology manages to do is to take some of the things which we think of as the more pleasant sides of human nature, such as altruism, and to explain those in terms of self-protective, selfish, genetic imperatives, and things that biologically, are something we can't help, but also which are only relevant for our own family and kin.
Okay. One of the problems we have with Lorenz's approach was where he selected his evidence. Is this the same with? Well,
exactly. I mean, that is precisely the problem. That E.O. Wilson, who developed the theory, originally developed it from work with white ants. And
near human species, then?
Very close, yes. And the problem with that is that there are so many other species which are very, very much closer, and which again show much more adaptability in their behaviour. When we start to develop theories about human behaviour by drawing from species that evolutionarily are very different and very, very far away from us, then we're bound to get a distorted picture. What we really need to look at is to look at the range of potentials which the flexibility of mammalian behaviour, and particularly primate behaviour, gives us.
Right. But the point being that if you carefully select your species, you can have an argument that says anything.
Oh, pretty well, pretty well. But you don't.
Right. So if we go on from that and we say, go back to our reductionist approach, so what are the atoms of the various reductionist arguments, what are the atoms of the genetic approach then?
Well, the atoms of the genetic approach are really the gene.
Okay, and a
such.
gene is?
Well, that's the tricky question, because what a gene is to a biologist and what a gene is to a geneticist in particular, and a biologist interested in that side of biology, and what a gene is to a sociobiologist are two very, very different things. To a geneticist, a gene is a particular portion of chromosome material, and when it becomes activated, it generates the synthesis of a particular protein in the body. That's what a gene does.
So how do they make the jump from one to the other?
Well, exactly. To a sociobiologist, it's a unit of heredity, inherited behaviour, and the jump is magical. The jump is a sort of apparently magical concept which the sociobiologists make. They say, well, this is inherited and happens, but nobody really draws connections between the synthesis of a particular protein and the production of a form of behaviour.
Right. So are you saying that the protein synthesis side of the gene doesn't have any connection to behaviour?
No, I'm not saying that at all. I'm saying that it doesn't have a simple one-to-one connection with behaviour.
Right.
There are certainly things that human beings inherit which affect the way we act. One of the things we inherit is that the genes tell us to develop a brain, and that involves a great deal of protein synthesis, and that involves developing a massively complex structure which allows us to learn new forms of behaviour and to adapt our behaviour within our own lifetimes. So we don't need to inherit how we act, we can actually learn ways of acting.
So you're saying once we've got all the bits and bobs like a brain, then everything else is learnt?
Well, not necessarily everything. Certainly there are some kind of behavioural propensities which people may inherit. There are tendencies that we may have. For instance, we know, although every culture is different, babies all have a tendency to be sociable. They have a very strong inclination to learn from other people around them and to interact with other people around them. We know that human beings are very sensitive to non-verbal signals, and again that's part of our tendency to prefer to learn from other people rather than learning from maybe the physical world around us. We also have a tendency to shape our thinking in terms of them and us groups, and so on and so forth. These may well be inherited tendencies due to us being social animals and so on. But that's very different from inheriting behaviour, from inheriting specific actions or specific tendencies. We do inherit the ability to be aggressive. Equally well, we inherit the ability to be peaceable, and what we've inherited is the capacity for a whole range of things in between. That's what we need to be explaining, not just aggression.
All right, so why does all this argument matter then?
Politics.
Right.
It matters because once you start producing genetic explanations that imply that human behaviour is fixed, and once you use those genetic explanations to explain things like aggression or territoriality, or even to start saying that altruism is justified, is inevitable, but only when applying to close family and kin, then what you've started to do is to say there is no need for further explanation. We don't need to look for other sources of aggression. We don't need to explain things like inner city riots in terms of social deprivation, in terms of inequalities, in terms of social unfairness, because we can write it all off by saying it's genetic, those are nasty people, they're aggressive people, or whatever. And we can use those to legitimise social practices which keep people from working towards a fairer society or a better
So
way
what
of
seems
living.
like quite a simple and interesting academic debate has actually a number of serious consequences
It's actually
for our
all
lives.
Yes, it's a powerfully political debate, and it's really very much about what we should do in society. If we start saying, oh well, everything isn't. All these unpleasant characteristics are inherited, then we're talking about creating societies which contain that, which can control it. If we start saying, well, maybe we have the capacity for aggression or for peaceableness, let's look at the factors which bring out aggression, then that leads us to a whole different set of questions, which are a much more positive set of questions, but they are more uncomfortable for politicians because they start saying, let's try and address some of the things which create the frustration that breeds aggression and so on.
Okay, good.
Yeah.
So what's the alternative to all these arguments then?
Well, the alternative is to develop theories which are able to work at different or with other theories at different levels of explanation. So we're not saying only this is a factor. We're saying this explanation may be one factor, but it also works together with a lot of other things at different levels.
Right.
So genetics may be some kind of influence on how people behave, but there are also cultural, economic, social, personal levels which also influence how people behave.
Right. So no more soundbite answers to complex problems.
Afraid not, no. That's the trouble. Reductionism gives you these nice, simple, easy answers, but they're also wrong. And sadly...
And that's why it'd be so popular, because you just got a simple answer to...
Yes, but the public aren't that thick. They're well able to encompass the idea that... no, you can laugh, but believe me, they're well able to encompass the idea that there can be more complex factors. They know that in their everyday lives, that there's more than one explanation, often for a great many things. And we're not saying there are two contradictory explanations. What we're saying is that several things work together to produce a result. Think of your football team. Lots of things working together. Well, all right, think of another football team. But lots of things working together to produce a result, not just one person or one individual. That's the difference between reductionist explanations and more positive, interactive explanations.
Right, so we're not saying any of the reductionist approaches are wrong, it's just they're not sufficient.
We're saying they become wrong when they start saying this is all there is.
Right.
Yeah, they're okay in their own right insofar as they can work with other theories.
Mm-hmm.
But when you start saying that's the only thing that matters, then you've got a problem.
Right. Well, thank you, Nikki.
You're welcome.